is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. This podcast uses the format of a book review to explore the intersection of philosophical naturalism with paleoconservatism and classical pagan thought. We will be exploring politics, philosophy, psychology, and sociology through a wide variety of books, published both recently and historically. Thank you for tuning in. For today's episode, I want to look at the basic writings of Carl Jung. This is edited by Violet de Laszlo. It was originally published in 1959, and it collects Carl Jung's writings for several decades prior to that. This is a great book. It's around over 500 pages long, and it includes samples of a whole bunch of his books on the nature of the psyche, symbols of transformation, all sorts of stuff, all sorts of essays, psychological types. It covers a lot of ground. And in this episode, I've got a bunch of sections in here that I want to read to you. There was one episode previously where I did a lot of reading, almost entirely just reading. I'm not going to do just reading, but I'm going to read a lot to you from this book today. The most important sections of it. And I'll provide a little bit of commentary as well, of course. But this is classic Carl Jung. I want to just let him speak in his own words. And, I selected a few parts that are more pertinent to the things that I talk about on this show. So, to start with, I want to read a section from Psychology and Religion where he talks about empiricism and his dedication to empiricism. And this is sort of just to set his particular psychoanalytic style into a sort of an epistemological framework and how he approaches, because this is sort of the orientation that he's going to take when he approaches the psychological archetypes and the contents of the unconscious. And this sort of empirical approach is similar to the stuff that I have appreciated in other authors that we've looked at. So he says, from Psychology and Religion, he says, quote, "Although I have often been called a philosopher, I am an empiricist, and adhere as such to the phenomenological standpoint. I trust that it does not conflict with the principles of scientific empiricism if one occasionally makes certain reflections which go beyond a mere accumulation and classification of experience. As a matter of fact, I believe that experience is not even possible without reflection, because experience is a process of assimilation, without which there could be no understanding. As this statement indicates, I approach psychological matters from a scientific and not from a philosophical standpoint. Inasmuch as religion has a very important psychological aspect, I deal with it from a purely empirical point of view. That is, I restrict myself to the observation of phenomena, and I eschew any metaphysical or philosophical considerations. I do not deny the validity of these other considerations, but I cannot claim to be competent to apply them correctly. I am aware that most people believe they know all there is to be known about psychology because they think that psychology is nothing but what they know of themselves. But I am afraid psychology is a good deal more than that. While having little to do with philosophy, it has much to do with empirical facts, many of which are not easily accessible to the experience of the average man. It is my intention to give you a few glimpses of the way in which practical psychology comes up against the problem of religion." And then he goes on to say, quote, "Since I am going to present a rather unusual argument, I cannot assume that my audience will be fully acquainted with the methodological standpoint of the branch of psychology I represent. This standpoint is exclusively phenomenological. That is, it is concerned with occurrences, events, experiences. In a word, with facts. Its truth is a fact and not a judgment. When psychology speaks, for instance, of the motif of the virgin birth, it is only concerned with the fact that there is such an idea, but it is not concerned with the question whether such an idea is true or false in any other sense. The idea is psychologically true inasmuch as it exists. Psychological existence is subjective insofar as an idea occurs in only one individual, but it is objective insofar as that idea is shared by a society, by a consensus gentium. This point of view is the same as that of natural science. Psychology deals with ideas and other mental contents as zoology, for instance, deals with the different species of animals. An elephant is true because it exists. The elephant is neither an inference, nor a statement, nor the subjective judgment of a creator. It is a phenomenon. But we are so used to the idea that psychic events are willful and arbitrary products, or even the inventions of a human creator, that we can hardly rid ourselves of the prejudiced view that the psyche and its contents are nothing but our own arbitrary invention, or the more or less illusory product of supposition and judgment. The fact is that certain ideas exist almost everywhere and at all times and can even spontaneously create themselves, quite independently of migration and tradition. They are not made by the individual. They just happen to him. They even force themselves on his consciousness. This is not Platonic philosophy, but empirical psychology. End quote. So that's cool. He mentions Platonic philosophy at the end there, and I think that some of the archetypal ideas that Jung has do resemble Platonic ideas, the Platonic realm of ideas. And so I think that's kind of an interesting exploration, examination, and comparison that I want to bring up periodically. Because I've talked about Plato and Aristotle a little bit, I tend to align more with the ideas of Aristotle. But it's interesting to see that some of the empirical, which is really the Aristotelian in a way, approach can uncover these same sort of foundational ideas that he refers to here as the empirical facts of psychology. So at this point, I want to jump to the beginning of this book, to one of his. That was from the end. I think it was one of his later works. This is not in chronological order, but in the beginning is one of his early books, or I think it's his first book, Symbols of Transformation, which wasn't the original name of the book, but it's the name that's more widely known as Symbols of Transformation. And when he talks about two kinds of thinking, and this sort of throws back to thinking fast and slow in a way, and the two different ways of approaching philosophy and psychology and human nature that we've been talking about so far. So he talks about two kinds of thinking. He says, quote, "As most people know, one of the basic principles of analytical psychology is that dream images are to be understood symbolically. That is to say, one must not take them literally, but must surmise a hidden meaning in them. This ancient idea of dream symbolism has roused not only criticism, but the strongest opposition. That dreams should have a meaning, and should therefore be capable of interpretation, is certainly neither a strange nor an extraordinary idea. It has been known to mankind for thousands of years. Indeed, it has become something of a truism. One remembers having heard even at school of Egyptian and Chaldean dream interpreters. Everyone knows the story of Joseph, who interpreted Pharaoh's dreams, and of Daniel and the dream of King Nebuchadnezzar. And the dream book of Artemidorus is familiar to many of us. From the written records of all times and peoples, we learn of significant and prophetic dreams, of warning dreams and of healing dreams sent by the gods. When an idea is so old and so generally believed, it must be true in some way, by which I mean that it is psychologically true. But if we translate this into the language of psychology, the ancient idea becomes much more comprehensible. The dream, we would say, originates in an unknown part of the psyche, and prepares the dreamer for the events of the following day. According to the old belief, a god or demon spoke to the sleeper in symbolic language, and the dream interpreter had to solve the riddle. In modern speech, we would say that the dream is a series of images which are apparently contradictory and meaningless, but that it contains material which yields a clear meaning when properly translated." End quote. So that's cool. He's basically talking about how dreams are translatable, sort of encoded messages, and he doesn't use that language, but that it's a creation of some part of your inner mind. Later on in that section, he says, quote, "How is it that dreams are symbolical at all? In other words, whence comes this capacity for symbolic representation, of which we can discover no trace in our conscious thinking? Let us examine the matter a little more closely. If we analyze a train of thought, we find that we begin with an initial idea or a leading idea, and then, without thinking back to it each time but merely guided by a sense of direction, we pass on to a series of separate ideas that all hang together. There's nothing symbolical in this, and our whole conscious thinking proceeds along these lines. If we scrutinize our thinking more closely and follow out an intensive train of thought, the solution to a difficult problem, for instance, we suddenly notice that we are thinking in words, that in very intensive thinking we begin talking to ourselves, or that we occasionally write down the problem, or make a drawing of it so as to be absolutely clear. Anyone who has lived for some time in a foreign country will certainly have noticed that after a while he begins to think in the language of that country. Any very intensive train of thought works itself out in more or less verbal form, if that is to say one wants to express it or teach it or convince someone of it. It is evidently directed outwards to the outside world. To that extent, directed or logical thinking is reality thinking, a thinking that is adapted to reality, by means of which we imitate the successiveness of objectively real things, so that the images inside our mind follow one another in the same strictly causal sequence as the events taking place outside it. We also call this thinking with directed attention. It has, in addition, the peculiarity of causing fatigue, and is for that reason brought into play for short periods only. The whole laborious achievement of our lives is adaptation to reality, part of which consists in directed thinking. In biological terms, it is simply a process of psychic assimilation that leaves behind a corresponding state of exhaustion, like any other vital achievement. The material with which we think is language and verbal concepts, something which from time immemorial has been directed outwards and used as a bridge, and which has but a single purpose, namely that of communication. So long as we think directedly, we think for others and speak to others. Language was originally a system of emotive and imitative sounds, sounds which express terror, fear, anger, love, etc., and sounds which imitate the noises of the elements, the rushing and gurgling of water, the rolling of thunder, the roaring of the wind, the cries of the animal world, and so on. And lastly, those which represent a combination of the sound perceived and the emotional reaction to it. A large number of onomatopoeic vestiges remain, even in the more modern languages. Thus, language, in its origin and essence, is simply a system of signs or symbols that denote real occurrences or their echo in the human soul. We must emphatically agree with Anatole France when he says, "What is thinking, and how does one think? We think with words. That in itself is sensual and brings us back to nature. Think of it. A metaphysician has nothing with which to build his world system except the perfected cries of monkeys and dogs. What he calls profound speculation and transcendental method is merely the stringing together in the arbitrary order of onomatopoeic cries of hunger, fear, and love from the primeval forests, to which have become attached little by little meanings that are believed to be abstract merely because they are loosely used. Have no fear that the succession of little cries, extinct or enfeebled, that composes a book of philosophy will teach us so much about the universe that we can no longer go on living in it." So, our directed thinking, even though we be the loneliest thinkers in the world, is nothing but the first stirrings of a cry to our companions that water has been found, or the bear has been killed, or that a storm is approaching, or that wolves are prowling round the camp. There is a striking paradox of Abelard's which intuitively expresses the human limitations of our complicated thought process. Speech is generated by the intellect, and in turn generates intellect. The most abstract system of philosophy is, in its method and purpose, nothing more than an extremely ingenious combination of natural sounds. Hence the craving of a Schopenhauer or a Nietzsche for recognition and understanding, and the despair and bitterness of their loneliness. One might expect perhaps that a man of genius would luxuriate in the greatness of his own thoughts and renounce the cheap approbation of the rabble he despises. Yet he succumbs to the more powerful impulse of the herd instinct. His seeking and his finding, his heart's cry, are meant for the herd and must be heeded by them. End quote. So here he's talking about how directed thinking is essentially language and communicative. And even the deepest philosophy is ultimately an attempt at communication, an attempt to be heard and recognized by other people. He's basically combining two real elements here, that of our fundamental communal nature and the communicative function of our directed thinking, and also the connection of our language back to back in the evolutionary tree to the original cries that we would make to communicate with each other about the most basic elements, like danger nearby, I'm afraid, I'm angry. These kinds of things just language evolved out of that basic communicative capacity. So then, later on again in Symbols of Transformation, he says, quote, "What happens when we do not think directedly? Well, our thinking then lacks all leading ideas and the sense of direction emanating from them. We no longer compel our thoughts along a definite track, but let them float, sink, or rise according to their specific gravity. In Quelpa's view, thinking is a sort of inner act of the will, and its absence necessarily leads to an automatic play of ideas. William James regards non-directed thinking, or merely associative thinking, as the ordinary kind. He expresses himself as follows: Much of our thinking consists of trains of images suggested one by another, or a sort of spontaneous reverie, of which it seems likely enough that the higher brutes should be capable. This sort of thinking leads, nevertheless, to rational conclusions, both practical and theoretical. As a rule, in this sort of irresponsible thinking, the terms which come to be coupled together are empirical concretes, not abstractions." We can supplement James's definitions by saying that this sort of thinking does not tire us, that it leads us away from reality into fantasies of the past or future. And at this point, thinking in verbal form ceases. Images pile on image, feeling on feeling, and there is an ever-increasing tendency to shuffle things about and arrange them not as they are in reality, but as one would like them to be. Naturally enough, the stuff of this thinking, which shies away from reality, can only be the past with its 1,001 memory images. Common speech calls this kind of thinking dreaming. Anyone who observes himself attentively will find that the idioms of common speech are very much to the point, for almost every day we can see ourselves when falling asleep, how our fantasies get woven into our dreams, so that between daydreaming and night dreaming there is not much difference. We have therefore two kinds of thinking: directed thinking and dreaming or fantasy thinking. The former operates with speech elements for the purpose of communication and is difficult and exhausting. The latter is effortless, working as it were spontaneously, with the contents ready to hand and guided by unconscious motives. The one produces innovations and adaptation, copies reality and tries to act upon it. The other turns away from reality, sets free subjective tendencies, and as regards adaptation, is unproductive. End quote. So basically he's saying that other than the directed thinking, the language-based thinking, you've got this other dreaming type of thinking, this fantasy thinking that's not really, where things aren't really bound one to another through the same ties of cause and effect and whatnot, that things are, the way things are all tied together in reality, we just kind of like put our own hand upon them, and it's like this associative, they almost just spring to us, these other ideas. We don't have to work for them. It's almost like a passive type of thinking, and this is the same sort of split between directed thinking and non-directed thinking that was in that Thinking Fast and Slow by Kahneman that we reviewed earlier. So from that point, I want to jump to the next book in here, On the Nature of the Psyche. And he talks a little bit in here about evolution, and that's the part that I want to read this section here. So he says in this part, he says, quote, "In view of the structure of the body, it would be astonishing if the psyche were the only biological phenomenon not to show clear traces of its evolutionary history, and it is altogether probable that these marks are closely connected with the instinctual base. Instinct and the archaic mode meet in the biological conception of the pattern of behavior. There are in fact no amorphous instincts, as every instinct bears in itself the pattern of its situation. Always it fulfills an image, and the image has fixed qualities. The instinct of the leaf-cutting ant fulfills the image of ant, tree, leaf, cutting, transport, and the little ant garden of fungi. If any of these conditions is lacking, the instinct does not function, because it cannot exist without its total pattern, without its image. Such an image is an a priori type. It is inborn in the ant prior to any activity, for there can be no activity at all unless an instinct or corresponding pattern initiates and makes it possible. This schema holds true of all instincts, and is found in identical form in all individuals of the same species. The same is true also of man. He has in him these a priori instinct types, which provide the occasion and the pattern for his activities, insofar as he functions instinctively. As a biological being, he has no choice but to act in a specifically human way, and fulfill his pattern of behavior. This sets narrow limits to his possible range of volition. The more narrow, the more primitive he is, and the more his consciousness is dependent upon the instinctual sphere. Although from one point of view it is quite correct to speak of the pattern of behavior as a still existing archaic vestige, as Nietzsche did in respect to the function of dreams, such an attitude does scant justice to the biological and psychological meaning of these types. They are not just relics or vestiges of earlier modes of functioning. They are the ever-present and biologically necessary regulators of the instinctual sphere, whose range of action covers the whole realm of the psyche, and only loses its absoluteness when limited by the relative freedom of the will. We must say that the image represents the meaning of the instinct. Although the existence of an instinctual pattern in human biology is probable, it seems very difficult to prove the existence of distinct types empirically. For the organ with which we might apprehend them, consciousness, is not only itself a transformation of the original instinctual image, but also its transformer. It is therefore not surprising that the human mind finds it impossible to classify man into proper types similar to those we know in the animal kingdom. I must confess that I can see no direct way to solve this problem, and yet I have succeeded, or so I believe, in finding at least an indirect way of approach to the instinctual image. In what follows, I would like to give a brief description of how this discovery took place. I had often observed patients whose dreams pointed to a rich store of fantasy material. Equally, from the patients themselves, I got the impression that they were stuffed full of fantasies, without their being able to tell me just where the inner pressure lay. I therefore took up a dream image or an association of the patient's, and with this as a point of departure, set him the task of elaborating or developing his theme by giving free rein to his fantasy. This, according to individual taste and talent, could be done in any number of ways: dramatic, dialectic, visual, acoustic, or in the form of dancing, painting, drawing, or modeling. The result of this technique was a vast number of complicated designs whose diversity puzzled me for years, until I was able to recognize that in this method I was witnessing the spontaneous manifestation of an unconscious process which was merely assisted by the technical ability of the patient, and to which I later gave the name individuation process. But long before this recognition dawned upon me, I had made the discovery that the method often diminished, to a considerable degree, the frequency and intensity of the dreams, thus reducing the inexplicable pressure exerted by the unconscious. In many cases this brought a large measure of therapeutic success, which encouraged both myself and the patient to press forward, despite the baffling nature of the results. I felt bound to insist that they were baffling, if only to stop myself from framing, on the basis of certain theoretical assumptions, interpretations which I felt were not only inadequate but liable to prejudice the ingenious productions of the patient. The more I suspected these configurations of harboring a certain purposefulness, the less inclined I was to risk any theories about them. This reticence was not made easy for me, since in many cases I was dealing with patients who needed an intellectual point of support if they were not to get totally lost in the darkness. I had to try to give provisional interpretations at least, so far as I was able, interspersing them with innumerable perhapses and ifs and buts, and never stepping beyond the bounds of the picture lying before me. I always took good care to let the interpretation of each image tail off into a question whose answer was left to the free fantasy activity of the patient. The chaotic assortment of images that at first confronted me reduced itself in the course of the work to certain well-defined themes and formal elements, which repeated themselves in identical or analogous form with the most varied individuals. I mention, as the most salient characteristics, chaotic multiplicity and order, duality, the opposition of light and dark, upper and lower, right and left, the union of opposites in a third, the quaternity, square, cross, rotation, circle, sphere, and finally the centering process, and a radial arrangement that usually followed some quaternary system. Triadic formations, apart from the complexio oppositorum in a third, were relatively rare and formed notable exceptions which could be explained by special conditions. The centering process is, in my experience, the never-to-be-surpassed climax of the whole development, and is characterized as such by the fact that it brings with it the greatest possible therapeutic effect. The typical features listed above go to the limits of abstraction, yet at the same time they are the simplest expressions of the formative principles here at work. In actual reality, the patterns are infinitely more variegated and far more concrete than this would suggest. Their variety defies description. I can only say that there is probably no motif in any known mythology that does not at some time appear in these configurations. If there was any conscious knowledge of mythological motifs worth mentioning in my patients, it is left far behind by the ingenuity of creative fantasy. These facts show in an unmistakable manner how fantasies guided by unconscious regulators coincide with the records of man's mental activity as known to us from tradition and ethnological research. All the abstract features I have mentioned are in a certain sense conscious. Everyone can count up to 4 and knows what a circle is and a square. But as formative principles, these are unconscious, and by the same token, their psychological meaning is not conscious either. My most fundamental view and ideas derive from these experiences. First, I made the observations, and only then did I hammer out my views. And so it is with the hand that guides the crayon or brush, the foot that executes the dance step, with the eye and the ear, with the word and the thought. A dark impulse is the ultimate arbiter of the pattern, and unconscious a priori precipitates itself into plastic form, and one has no inkling that another person's consciousness is being guided by these same principles at the very point where one feels utterly exposed to the boundless subjective vagaries of chance. Over the whole procedure, there seems to reign a dim foreknowledge, not only of the pattern, but of its meaning. Image and meaning are identical, and as the first takes shape, so the latter becomes clear. Actually, the pattern needs no interpretation. It portrays its own meaning. There are cases where I can let interpretation go as a therapeutic requirement. Scientific knowledge, of course, is another matter. Here we have to elicit from the sum total of our experience certain concepts of the greatest possible general validity, which are not given a priori. This particular work entails a translation of the timeless, ever-present operative archetype into the scientific language of the present. These experiences and reflections lead me to believe that there are certain collective unconscious conditions which act as regulators and stimulators of creative fantasy activity and call forth corresponding formations by availing themselves of the existing conscious material. They behave exactly like the motive forces of dreams, for which reason active imagination, as I have called this method, to some extent takes the place of dreams. The existence of these unconscious regulators, I sometimes refer to them as dominants because of their mode of functioning, seemed to me so important that I based upon it my hypothesis of an impersonal collective unconscious. The most remarkable thing about this method, I felt, was that it did not involve a reductio in primum figuram, but rather a synthesis, supported by an attitude voluntarily adopted, though for the rest wholly natural, of passive conscious material and unconscious influences. Hence, a kind of spontaneous amplification of the archetypes. The images are not to be thought of as a reduction of conscious contents to their simplest denominator, as this would be the direct road to the primordial images which I said previously was unimaginable. They only make their appearance in the course of amplification. On this natural amplification process, I also base my method of eliciting the meaning of dreams, for dreams behave in exactly the same way as active imagination. Only the support of conscious content is lacking. To the extent that the archetypes intervene in the shaping of conscious contents by regulating, modifying, and motivating them, they act like the instincts. It is therefore very natural to suppose that these factors are connected with the instincts, and to inquire whether the typical situational patterns which these collective form principles apparently represent are not in the end identical with the instinctual patterns, namely with the patterns of behavior. I must admit that up to the present I have not got hold of any argument that would finally refute this possibility. Before I pursue my reflections further, I must stress one aspect of the archetypes, which will be obvious to anybody who has practical experience of these matters. That is, the archetypes have, when they appear, a distinctly numinous character, which can only be described as spiritual, if magical is too strong a word. Consequently, this phenomenon is of the utmost significance for the psychology of religion. In its effects, it is anything but unambiguous. It can be healing or destructive, but never indifferent, provided, of course, that it has attained a certain degree of clarity. This aspect deserves the epithet spiritual above all else. It not infrequently happens that the archetype appears in the form of a spirit in dreams or fantasy products, or even comports itself like a ghost. There is a mystical aura about its numinosity, and it has a corresponding effect upon the emotions. It mobilizes philosophical and religious convictions in the very people who deem themselves miles above any such fits of weakness. Often it drives with unexampled passion and remorseless logic towards its goal and draws the subject under its spell from which, despite the most desperate resistance, he is unable and finally no longer even willing to break free, because the experience brings with it a depth and fullness of meaning that was unthinkable before. I fully appreciate the resistance that all rooted convictions are bound to put up against psychological discoveries of this kind. With more foreboding than real knowledge, most people feel afraid of the menacing power that lies fettered in each of us, only waiting for the magic word to release it from the spell. This magic word, which always ends in ism, works most successfully with those who have the least access to their interior selves and have strayed the furthest from their instinctual roots into the truly chaotic world of collective consciousness. End quote. All right, so that was kind of a long section there, but he introduces the idea of he talks about the collective unconscious, and then, but at the end when he's talking about the quote magic word that always ends in ism, he's talking about collective consciousness, which is different. It's kind of something that he warns against. It's like a groupthink. Collective unconscious, on the other hand, is the realm of the archetypes, and he talks about how the access to these collective unconscious archetypes is often experienced as a profoundly meaningful or spiritual experience. And he talks about how the archetypes and the unconscious just grasps hold of people and takes over their whole lives because it provides more powerful meaning than anything that they ordinarily experience. And he talks about how he came across this through research into people, patients of his as a psychologist, and he would open up their. He basically said that he felt there was the fantasy world was overpressured, like a pressure cooker. And it needed a. He says, I got the impression that they were stuffed full of fantasies without their being able to tell me just where the inner pressure lay. I therefore took up a dream image or association to the patients, and with this as a point of departure, set him the task of elaborating or developing his theme. So basically, he would take up fantasy ideas of his patients and allow them to just unravel these ideas through some sort of whatever creative means they could come up with. And he looked at it as a way of relieving this pressure of the unconscious mind or of the world of fantasy in his patients. And he saw the same sort of patterns repeatedly appear in different patients of his, and he talks about this duality, the light and dark, the circle, the square, the cross, this sort of sets of ideas, the centering, ideas that would repeat themselves in his patients. And that was how he began to develop the idea of the archetypes of the collective unconscious. So that's pretty interesting. He again stresses repeatedly that he wasn't trying to do any sort of interpretation. He was just trying to observe. And those were the patterns that he observed. And so he's again stressing that this is an empirical process. And I'm sure he has to stress that because I'm sure that his ideas were sort of looked at as kind of mystical and not like hard science. Like the other natural sciences of chemistry and physics and whatever. They didn't look at analytical psychology and Freud and Jung as being the same sort of, and they're not exactly the same sort of sciences. And so he's probably self-consciously continually trying to reinforce the empiricism of his psychological discoveries. So at this point, I'm going to jump back to symbols of transformation. And he's got a section here when he talks more about this dream thinking. He says, quote, "If we go far back into history, we find what we call science dissolving in an indistinct mist. The culture-creating mind is ceaselessly employed in stripping experience of everything subjective and in devising formulas to harness the forces of nature and express them in the best way possible. It would be a ridiculous and unwarranted presumption on our part if we imagined that we were more energetic or more intelligent than the men of the past. Our material knowledge has increased, but not our intelligence. This means that we are just as bigoted in regard to new ideas and just as impervious to them as people were in the darkest days of antiquity. We have become rich in knowledge, but poor in wisdom. The center of gravity of our interest has switched over to the materialistic side, whereas the ancients preferred a mode of thought nearer to the fantastic type. To the classical mind, everything was still saturated with mythology, even though classical philosophy and the beginnings of natural science undeniably prepared the way for the work of enlightenment. Unfortunately, we get at school only a very feeble idea of the richness and tremendous vitality of Greek mythology. All the creative powers that modern man pours into science and techniques, the man of antiquity devoted to his myths. This creative urge explains the bewildering confusion, the kaleidoscopic changes and syncretistic regroupings, the continual rejuvenation of myths in Greek culture. We move in a world of fantasies, which, untroubled by the outward course of things, well up from an inner source to produce an ever-changing succession of plastic or phantasmal forms. This activity of the early classical mind was in the highest degree artistic. The goal of its interest does not seem to have been how to understand the real world as objectively and accurately as possible, but how to adapt it aesthetically to subjective fantasies and expectations. There was very little room among the ancients for that coldness and disillusionment which Giordano Bruno's vision of infinite worlds and Kepler's discoveries brought to mankind. The naive man of antiquity saw the sun as the great father of heaven and earth, and the moon as the fruitful mother. Everything had its demon, was animated like a human being, or like his brothers the animals. Everything was conceived anthropomorphically or theriomorphically, in the likeness of man or beast. Even the sun's disk was given wings or little feet to illustrate its motion. Thus there arose a picture of the universe which was completely removed from reality, but which corresponded exactly to man's subjective fantasies. It needs no very elaborate proof to show that children think in much the same way. They too animate their dolls and toys, and with imaginative children, it's easy to see that they inhabit a world of marvels. End quote. So he's looking back to ancient Greece here and the mythological way of thinking. He compares it to the way children think. Everything is anthropomorphized or heliomorphized. So, taking these forms of men or beasts. The sun moves as a chariot. Everything is given spirit. All of the rivers and forests have their own spirits and everything. He says it's basically a world of dreams. And he says the early classical mind, the activity of the early classical mind was in the highest degree artistic. The creation of myth was a artistic process, an aesthetic process to fit reality to the forms of our subjective fantasies and expectations, is essentially what he's saying in that section. So I want to jump to a different section. This section is taken from an essay called "The Relations Between the Ego and the Unconscious," taken from a volume 2 essays on analytical psychology. So from relations between the ego and the unconscious, he talks a little bit about the value and purpose of the unconscious mind in our lives. He says, quote, "There are certainly not a few people who are afraid to admit that the unconscious could ever have big ideas. They will object, but do you really believe that the unconscious is capable of offering anything like a constructive criticism of our Western mentality? Of course, if we take the problem intellectually and impute rational intentions to the unconscious, the thing becomes absurd. But it would never do to foist our conscious psychology upon the unconscious. Its mentality is an instinctive one. It has no differentiated functions, and it does not think as we understand thinking. It simply creates an image that answers to the conscious situation. This image contains as much thought as feeling, and is anything rather than a product of rationalistic reflection. Such an image would be better described as an artistic vision. We tend to forget that a problem like the one which underlies the dream last mentioned cannot, even to the conscious mind of the dreamer, be an intellectual problem, but is profoundly emotional. For a moral man, the ethical problem is a passionate question which has its roots in the deepest instinctual processes, as well as in his most idealistic aspirations. The problem for him is devastatingly real. It is not surprising, therefore, that the answer likewise springs from the depths of his nature. The fact that everyone thinks his psychology is the measure of all things, and if he also happens to be a fool, will inevitably think that such a problem is beneath his notice, should not trouble the psychologist in the least, for he has to take things objectively, as he finds them, without twisting them to fit his subjective suppositions. The richer and more capacious natures may legitimately be gripped by an impersonal problem, and to the extent that this is so, their unconscious can answer in the same style. And just as the conscious mind can put the question, "Why is there this frightful conflict between good and evil?" so the unconscious can reply, "Look closer, each needs the other. The best, just because it is the best, holds the seed of evil, and there is nothing so bad but good can come of it." It might then dawn on the dreamer that the apparently insoluble conflict is perhaps a prejudice, a frame of mind, conditioned by time and place. The seemingly complex dream image might easily reveal itself as plain instinctive common sense, as the tiny germ of a rational idea, which a maturer mind could just as well have thought consciously. At all events, Chinese philosophy thought of it ages ago. The singularly apt, plastic configuration of thought is the prerogative of that primitive natural spirit which is alive in all of us and is only obscured by a one-sided conscious development. If we consider the unconscious compensations from this angle, we might justifiably be accused of judging the unconscious too much from the conscious standpoint. And indeed, in pursuing these reflections, I have always started from the view that the unconscious simply reacts to the conscious contents, albeit in a very significant way, but that it lacks initiative. It is, however, far from my intention to give the impression that the unconscious is merely reactive in all cases. On the contrary, there is a host of experiences which seem to prove that the unconscious is not only spontaneous, but can actually take the lead. There are innumerable cases of people who lingered on in a pettifogging unconsciousness only to become neurotic in the end. Thanks to the neurosis contrived by the unconscious, they are shaken out of their apathy, and this in spite of their own laziness and often desperate resistance. Yet it would, in my view, be wrong to suppose in such cases the unconscious is working to a deliberate and concerted plan, and is striving to realize certain definite ends. I have found nothing to support this assumption. The driving force, so far as it is possible for us to grasp it, seems to be in essence only an urge towards self-realization. If it were a matter of some general teleological plan, then all individuals who enjoy a surplus of unconsciousness would necessarily be driven towards higher consciousness by an irresistible urge. That is plainly not the case. There are vast masses of the population who, despite their notorious unconsciousness, never get anywhere near a neurosis. The few who are smitten by such a fate are really persons of the higher type who, for one reason or another, have remained too long on a primitive level. Their nature does not, in the long run, tolerate persistence in what for them is an unnatural torpor. As a result of their narrow conscious outlook, and their cramped existence. They save energy. Bit by bit, it accumulates in the unconscious and finally explodes in the form of a more or less acute neurosis. This simple mechanism does not necessarily conceal a plan. A perfectly understandable urge towards self-realization would provide a quite satisfactory explanation. We could also speak of a retarded maturation of the personality. Since it is highly probable that we are still a long way from the summit of absolute consciousness, presumably everyone is capable of wider consciousness, and we may assume accordingly that the unconscious processes are constantly supplying us with contents, which, if consciously recognized, would extend the range of consciousness. Looked at in this way, the unconscious appears as a field of experience of unlimited extent. If it were merely reactive to the conscious mind, we might aptly call it a psychic mirror world. In that case, the real source of all contents and activities would lie in the conscious mind, and there would be absolutely nothing in the unconscious except the distorted reflections of conscious contents. The creative process would be shut up in the conscious mind, and anything new would be nothing but conscious invention or cleverness. The empirical facts give lie to this. Every creative man knows that spontaneity is the very essence of creative thought, because the unconscious is not just a reactive mirror reflection, but an independent, productive activity. Its realm of experience is a self-contained world, having its own reality, of which we can only say that it affects us as we affect it, precisely what we say about our experiences of the outer world. And just as material objects are the constituent element of this world, so psychic factors constitute the objects of that other world. End quote. So in this section, he does refer back early on to a previous dream that he had mentioned. That was in a section I didn't talk about. But the basic idea stands that the contents of this dream come from the unconscious mind. They come from the dream side of thinking, dreaming fantasy side of thinking, and that they're like drastically real for people. And there was one section, one line I wanted to go back and reread. With this line here, he says, quote, "Since it is highly probable that we are still a long way from the summit of absolute consciousness, presumably everyone is capable of wider consciousness, and we may assume accordingly that the unconscious processes are constantly supplying us with contents which, if consciously recognized, would extend the range of consciousness." So what he's saying here is that we have not yet achieved the if there is a pinnacle of conscious capacity, we as humans have not achieved it. So then everyone is capable. Now, this is a leap to make here, but I think there's some validity here. He says, presumably everyone is capable of wider consciousness. So that we're all capable of expanding our conscious capacity from what it currently is. I don't know if that's a presumption you can logically make, but I think we can go with it. People, you can learn more. You can expand your consciousness in the sense of gaining deeper access. What he's really talking about is gaining deeper relationship with the unconscious mind, as a sort of expanded consciousness. That we're all capable of deepening our conscious experience and widening and broadening our conscious experience to incorporate more elements of ourselves and more capacities, I would assume. We may assume accordingly that the unconscious processes are constantly supplying us with contents, which, if consciously recognized, would extend the range of consciousness. So we're constantly receiving content from our unconscious minds that colors our world, that the more we bring this into our conscious mind and become aware of the unconscious contents, that would extend the range of consciousness. So that's kind of like a tricky section, but I think it's an important line to look a little deeper at. And he talks about, it's not a mirror reflection of the conscious world. It's its own creative thing that your consciousness interacts with, in the same way that your consciousness interacts with the outer world made up of material objects. So also your conscious mind interacts with an inner world made up of psychic factors, is what he's saying at the end of that section. So then I want to go back for a second to what I had read earlier about the line where he says it usually ends with an ism. He's talking about ideologies. He talks a little bit more about ideologies and that collective consciousness that I had mentioned. He had kind of suggested in an offhand way in a previous section. He talks a little bit more about it here, and I wanted to look at that. He says, quote, "There are objective psychic factors, which are every bit as important as radios and automobiles. Ultimately, everything, particularly in the case of the atom bomb, depends on the uses to which these factors are put, and that is always conditioned by one's state of mind. The current isms are the most serious threat in this respect, because they are nothing but dangerous identifications of the subjective with the collective consciousness. Such an identity infallibly produces a mass psyche with its irresistible urge to catastrophe. Subjective consciousness does not, in order to escape this doom, avoid identification with collective consciousness by recognizing its shadow as well as the existence and the importance of the archetypes." Let me read that sentence again. Subjective consciousness must, in order to escape this doom, avoid identification with collective consciousness by recognizing its shadow, as well as the existence and the importance of the archetypes. These latter are an effective defense against the brute force of collective consciousness and the mass psyche that goes with it. In point of effectiveness, the religious outlook of medieval man corresponds roughly to the attitude induced in the ego by the integration of unconscious contents, with the difference that in the latter case, suggestibility to environmental influences and unconsciousness are replaced by scientific objectivity and conscious knowledge. But so far as religion, for the contemporary consciousness, still means, if anything, a creed, and hence a collectively accepted system of religious statements neatly codified as potted dogmatic precepts, it has more affinities with collective consciousness, even though its symbols express the once operative archetypes. So long as the communal consciousness presided over by the Church is objectively present, the psyche, as said, continues to enjoy a certain equilibrium. At all events, it constitutes a sufficiently effective defense against inflation of the ego. But once Mother Church and her motherly eros fall into abeyance, the individual is at the mercy of any passing collectivism and the attendant mass psyche. He succumbs to social or national inflation, and the tragedy is that he does so with the same psychic attitude which had once bound him to a church. But if he is independent enough to recognize the bigotedness of the social ism, he may then be threatened with subjective inflation, for usually he is not capable of seeing that religious ideas do not, in psychological reality, rest solely upon tradition and faith, but originate with the archetypes, the careful consideration of which constitutes the essence of religion. The archetypes are continuously present and active. As such, they need not believing in, but only an intuition of their meaning, and a certain sapient awe, a desidaimonia, which never loses sight of their import. A consciousness sharpened by experience knows the catastrophic consequences that disregard of this entails for the individual as well as for society, Just as the archetype is partly a spiritual factor and partly like a hidden meaning immanent in the instincts, so the spirit, as I have shown in another Eranos lecture, is two-faced and paradoxical, a great help and an equally great danger. It seems as if man were destined to play a decisive role in solving this uncertainty, and to solve it moreover by virtue of his consciousness, which once started up like a light in the murk of the primeval world. Nowhere do we know for sure about these matters, but least of all where isms flourish, for they are only a sophisticated substitute for the lost link with psychic reality. The mass psyche that infallibly results destroys the meaning of the individual and of culture generally. From this, it is clear that the psyche not only disturbs the natural order, but, if it loses its balance, actually destroys its own creation. Therefore, the careful consideration of psychic factors is of importance in restoring not merely the individual's balance, but society's as well. Otherwise, the destructive tendencies easily gain the upper hand. In the same way that the atom bomb is an unparalleled means of physical mass destruction, so the misguided development of the soul must lead to psychic mass destruction. The present situation is so sinister that one cannot suppress the suspicion that the Creator is planning another deluge that will finally exterminate the existing race of men. But if anyone imagines that a healthy belief in the existence of archetypes can be inculcated from outside, he is as simple as the people who want to outlaw war or the atom bomb. Such measures remind one of the bishop who excommunicated the cockchafers for their unseemly proliferation. Change of consciousness begins at home. It is a secular matter that depends entirely on how far the psyche's capacity for development extends. As we know at present, all we know at present is that there are single individuals who are capable of developing. How great their total number is we do not know, just as we do not know what the suggestive power of an extended consciousness may be, or what influence it may have upon the world at large. Effects of this kind never depend on the reasonableness of an idea, but far more on the question, is the time ripe for change or not? End quote. So that section, there was one particular, he says, quote, religious ideas do not, in psychological reality, rest solely upon tradition and faith, but originate with the archetypes, the careful consideration of which constitutes the essence of religion. That's an important point there, where he's talking about basically that the archetypes constitute the foundation of religion, of course, blended in with the other points that he mentions of tradition and faith, but that, he says, the archetypes constitute the essence of religion. That's an interesting perspective. I think that there's a lot to that. We'll explore that a little bit further as well. But there's, I want to keep moving on here. This is a section from Archetypes of the Collective Unconscious. In this section, he says, quote, "The hypothesis of a collective unconscious belongs to the class of ideas that people at first find strange, but soon come to possess and use as familiar conceptions. This has been the case with the concept of the unconscious in general. After the philosophical idea of the unconscious, in the form presented chiefly by Karras and von Hartmann, has gone down under the overwhelming wave of materialism, leaving hardly a ripple behind it. It gradually reappeared in the scientific domain of medical psychology. At first, the concept of the unconscious was limited to denoting the state of repressed or forgotten contents. Even with Freud, who makes the unconscious, at least metaphorically, take the stage as the acting subject, it is really nothing but the gathering place of forgotten and repressed contents, and has a functional significance thanks only to these. For Freud, accordingly, the unconscious is of an exclusively personal nature, although he was aware of its archaic and mythological thought forms. A more or less superficial layer of the unconscious is undoubtedly personal. I call it the personal unconscious. But this personal unconscious rests upon a deeper layer, which does not derive from the personal experience and is not a personal acquisition, but is inborn. The deeper layer I call the collective unconscious. I have chosen the term collective because this part of the unconscious is not individual but universal. In contrast to the personal psyche, it has contents and modes of behavior that are more or less the same everywhere and in all individuals. It is, in other words, identical in all men, and thus constitutes a common psychic substrate of a suprapersonal nature, which is present in every one of us. Psychic existence can be recognized only by the presence of contents that are capable of consciousness. We can therefore speak of an unconscious only insofar as we are able to demonstrate its contents. The contents of the personal unconscious are chiefly the feeling-toned complexes, as they are called. They constitute the personal and private side of psychic life. The contents of the collective unconscious, on the other hand, are known as archetypes. He goes on to say, quote, "A well-known expression of the archetypes is myth and fairy tale. But here we are dealing with forms that have received a specific stamp and have been handed down through long periods of time. The term archetype, since it designates only those psychic contents which have not yet been submitted to conscious elaboration, and are therefore an immediate datum of psychic experience. In this sense, there is a considerable difference between the archetype and the historical formula which has evolved. Especially on the higher levels of esoteric teaching, the archetypes appear in a form that reveals quite unmistakably the critical and evaluating influence of conscious elaboration. Their immediate manifestation, as we encounter it in dreams and visions, is much more individual, less understandable, and more naive than in myths, for example. The archetype is essentially an unconscious content that is altered by becoming conscious and by being perceived, and it takes its color from the individual consciousness in which it happens to appear. What the word archetype means in the nominal sense is clear enough, then, from its relations with myth, esoteric teaching, and fairy tale. But if we try to establish what an archetype is psychologically, the matter becomes more complicated. So far, mythologists have always had recourse to solar, lunar, meteorological, vegetal, and various other ideas of the kind. The fact that myths are first and foremost psychic phenomena that reveal the nature of the soul is something they have absolutely refused to see until now. Primitive man is not much interested in objective explanations of the obvious, but he has an imperative need, or rather his unconscious psyche has an irresistible urge to assimilate all outer sense experiences to inner psychic events. It is not enough for the primitive to see the sun rise and set. His external observation must at the same time be a psychic happening. The sun in its course must represent the fate of a god or hero who, in the last analysis, dwells nowhere except in the soul of man. All the mythologized processes of nature, such as summer and winter, the phases of the moon, the rainy seasons, and so forth, are in no sense allegories of these objective experiences. Rather, they are symbolic expressions of the inner unconscious drama of the psyche, which becomes accessible to man's consciousness by way of projection, that is, mirrored in the events of nature. The projection is so fundamental that it has taken several thousand years of civilization to detach it in some measure from its outer object. In the case of astrology, for instance, This age-old scientia intuitiva came to be branded as rank heresy, because man had not yet succeeded in making the psychological description of character independent of the stars. Even today, people who still believe in astrology fall almost without exception for the old superstitious assumption of the influence of the stars. And yet anyone who can calculate a horoscope should know that, since the days of Hipparchus of Alexandria, the spring point has been fixed at 0 degrees Aries, and that the zodiac on which every horoscope is based is therefore quite arbitrary, the spring point having gradually advanced since then into the first degree of Pisces owing to the precession of the equinoxes. Primitive man impresses us so strongly with his subjectivity that we should really have guessed long ago that myths refer to something psychic. His knowledge of nature is essentially the language and outer dress of an unconscious psychic process. But the very fact that this process is unconscious gives us the reason why man has thought of everything except the psyche in his attempts to explain myths. He simply didn't know that the psyche contains all the images that have ever given rise to myths, and that our unconscious is an acting and suffering subject with an inner drama, which primitive man rediscovers by means of analogy in the processes of nature, both great and small." End quote. So he's talking about primitive man in the sense of man with a mythology that makes all the experiences of nature take on heroic connotations, and that all the mythological understanding of the natural world is archetypal in its basis. He gives a nice examination of archetypes being basically completely unconscious. What makes it the archetypes components of the unconscious is you cannot apprehend the archetype itself. That's what makes it unconscious. It manifests itself in contents that are, he says, psychic existence can be recognized only by the presence of contents that are capable of consciousness. We can therefore speak of an unconscious only insofar as we are able to demonstrate its contents. So he says the contents of the personal unconscious are called the feeling tone complexes, and the contents of the collective unconscious are known as archetypes. Then actually, there's another essay called Psychological Aspects of the Mother Archetype. And I want to read a little bit from this one, not so much about the mother archetype as the beginning part here about the concept of the archetype. He talks about Plato a little bit in this section, so I wanted to read that as well. He says, quote, "The concept of the Great Mother belongs to the field of comparative religion and embraces widely varying types of mother goddess. The concept itself is of no immediate concern to psychology, because the image of a great mother in this form is rarely encountered in practice, and then only under very special conditions. But obviously the symbol is a derivative of the mother archetype. If we venture to investigate the background of the great mother image from the standpoint of psychology, then the mother archetype, as the more inclusive of the two, must form the basis of our discussion. Though lengthy discussion of the concept of an archetype is hardly necessary at this stage, some preliminary remarks of a general nature may not be out of place. In former times, despite some dissenting opinion and the influence of Aristotle, it was not too difficult to understand Plato's conception of the idea as superordinate and pre-existent to all phenomena. Archetype, far from being a modern term, was already in use before the time of St. Augustine and was synonymous with idea in the Platonic usage. When the Corpus Hermeticum, which probably dates to the 3rd century, describes God as to archetypon phos, the archetypal light, it expresses the idea that he is the prototype of all light, that is to say, pre-existent and supraordinate to the phenomenon light. Were I a philosopher, I should continue in this Platonic strain and say, somewhere in a supra-celestial place there is a prototype or primordial image of the mother that is pre-existent and superordinate to all phenomena in which the maternal, in the broadest sense of the term, is manifest. But I am an empiricist, not a philosopher. I cannot let myself presuppose that my peculiar temperament, my own attitude to intellectual problems, is universally valid. Apparently this is an assumption in which only the philosopher may indulge, who always takes it for granted that his own disposition and attitude are universal, and will not recognize the fact, if he can avoid it, that his personal equation conditions his philosophy. As an empiricist, I must point out that there is a temperament which regards ideas as real entities and not merely as noumena. It so happens, by the merest accident one might say, that for the past 200 years we have been living in an age in which it has become unpopular or even unintelligible to suppose that ideas could be anything more than noumena. Anyone who continues to think as Plato did must pay for his anachronism by seeing the supra-celestial, i.e. metaphysical essence of the idea, relegated to the unverifiable realm of faith and superstition, or charitably left to the poet. Once again, in the age-old controversy over universals, the nominalistic standpoint has triumphed over the realistic, and the idea has evaporated into a mere flatus vocus. This change was accompanied, and indeed to a considerable degree caused, by the marked rise of empiricism, the advantages of which were only too obvious to the intellect. Since that time, the idea is no longer something a priori, but is secondary and derived. Naturally, the new nominalism promptly claimed universal validity for itself in spite of the fact that it too is based on a definite and limited thesis, colored by temperament. The thesis runs as follows. We accept as valid anything that comes from outside and can be verified. The ideal instance is verification by experiment. The antithesis is we accept as valid anything that comes from inside and cannot be verified. The hopelessness of this position is obvious. Greek natural philosophy, with its interest in matter, together with Aristotelian reasoning, has achieved a belated but overwhelming victory over Plato. Yet every victory contains the germ of future defeat. In our own day, signs foreshadowing a change of attitude are rapidly increasing. Significantly enough, it is Kant's doctrine of categories, more than anything else, that destroys, in embryo, every attempt to revive metaphysics in the old sense of the word, but at the same time paves the way for a rebirth of the Platonic spirit. If it be true that there can be no metaphysics transcending human reason, it is no less true that there can be no empirical knowledge that is not already caught and limited by the a priori structure of cognition. During the century and a half that we have elapsed into the appearance of the critique of pure reason, during the century and a half that have elapsed since the appearance of the critique of pure reason, the conviction has gradually gained ground that thinking, understanding, and reasoning cannot be regarded as independent processes subject only to the eternal laws of logic, but that, since they are psychic functions, coordinated with the personality and subordinate to it. We no longer ask, has this or that been seen, heard, handled, weighed, counted, thought, and found to be logical? We ask instead, who saw, heard, or thought? Beginning with the personal equation in the observation and measurement of minimal processes, the critical attitude has gone on to the creation of an empirical psychology such as no time before ours has known. Today we are convinced that in all fields of knowledge, psychological premises exist, which exert a decisive influence upon the choice of material, the method of investigation, the nature of the conclusions, and the formulation of hypotheses and theories. We have even come to believe that Kant's personality was a decisive conditioning factor of his critique of pure reason. Not only our philosophers, but our predilections in philosophy, and even what we are fond of calling our best truths, are affected, if not dangerously undermined, by this recognition of a personal premise. All creative freedom, we cry out, is taken away from us. What, can it be possible that a man only thinks or says or does what he himself is? Provided that we do not again exaggerate, and so fall a victim to unrestrained psychologizing, it seems to me that the critical standpoint here defined is inescapable. It constitutes the essence, origin, and method of modern psychology. There is an a priori factor in all human activities, namely the inborn, pre-conscious, and unconscious individual structure of the psyche. The pre-conscious psyche, for example, that of a newborn infant, is not an empty vessel into which, under favorable conditions, practically anything can be poured. On the contrary, it is a tremendously complicated, sharply defined individual entity which appears indeterminate to us only because we cannot see it directly. But the moment the first visible manifestations of psychic life begin to appear, one would have to be blind not to recognize their individual character, that is, the unique personality behind them. It is hardly possible to suppose that all these details come into being only at the moment in which they appear. When it is a case of morbid predispositions already present in the parents, we infer hereditary transmission through the germ plasm. It would not occur to us to regard epilepsy in the child of an epileptic mother as an unaccountable mutation. Again, we explain by heredity the gifts and talents which can be traced back through whole generations. We explain in the same way the reappearance of complicated instinctive patterns in animals that have never set eyes on their parents and therefore could not possibly have been taught by them. Nowadays, we have to start with the hypothesis that, so far as predisposition is concerned, there is no essential difference between man and all other creatures. Like every animal, he possesses a preformed psyche which breeds true to his species and which on closer examination reveals distinct features traceable to family antecedents. We have not the slightest reason to suppose that there are certain human activities or functions that could be exempted from this rule. We are unable to form any idea of what those dispositions or aptitudes are which make instinctive actions in animals possible. And it is just as impossible for us to know the nature of the preconscious psychic disposition that enables a child to react in a human manner. We can only suppose that his behavior results from patterns of functioning, which I have described as images. The term image is intended to express not only the form of the activity taking place, but the typical situation in which the activity is released. These images are primordial images, insofar as they are peculiar to whole species, and if they ever originated, their origin must have coincided at least with the beginning of the species. They are the human quality of the human being, the specifically human form his activities take. This specific form is hereditary and is already present in the germ plasm. The idea that it is not inherited but comes into being in every child anew would be just as preposterous as the primitive belief that the sun which rises in the morning is a different sun than that which set the evening before. Since everything psychic is preformed, this must also be true of the individual functions, especially those which derive directly from the unconscious predisposition. The most important of these is creative fantasy. In the products of fantasy, the primordial images are made visible, and it is here that the concept of the archetype finds its specific application. I do not claim to have been the first to point out this fact. The honor belongs to Plato." End quote. So that's cool. He kind of, rehabilitates Plato here in the concept of shared collective a priori ideas. He talks about Kant as well, and the necessary precondition of cognition, inborn cognition. He talks about it as really a physical, capacity of the newborn. He talks about newborns just naturally reacting as humans, right? Because their modes of cognition are pre-wired. He doesn't use the word pre-wired, but preformed. So, I think really that's the prime value of Plato. As he says basically nobody can really accept Plato's ideas as he presented them as a distinct entity, the ideas being distinct entities, but we can appreciate Plato if we understand what he describes as ideas to be human archetypes, ultimately contained within the human mind and ultimately contained within the human brain. And so, going further into this essay, The Psychological Aspects of the Mother Archetype, he talks here about archetypes as balancing agents. In this section, he says, quote, "Whether he understands them or not, man must remain conscious of the world of archetypes, because in it he is still a part of nature and connected with his own roots. A view of the world or a social order that cuts him off from the primordial images of life not only is no culture at all, but, in increasing degree, is a prison or a stable. If the primordial images remain conscious in some form or another, the energy that belongs to them can flow freely into man, but when it is no longer possible to maintain contact with them, then the tremendous sum of energy stored up in these images, which is also the source of the fascination underlying the infantile parental complex, falls back into the unconscious. The unconscious then becomes charged with a force that acts as an irresistible vis a tergo to whatever view or idea or tendency our intellect may choose to dangle enticingly before our desiring eyes. In this way, man is delivered over to his conscious side, and reason becomes the arbiter of right and wrong, of good and evil. I am far from wishing to belittle the divine gift of reason, man's highest faculty, but in the role of absolute tyrant it has no meaning, no more than light would remain in a world where its counterpart darkness was absent. Man would do well to heed the wise counsel of the mother, and obey the inexorable law of nature, which sets limits to every being. He ought never to forget that the world exists only because opposing forces are held at equilibrium. So, too, the rational is counterbalanced by the irrational, and what is planned and purposed by what is." End quote. I just like that section there. He's talking again about how if you don't have connection to the archetypes, to the images, the primordial images that channel the energy of your unconscious archetypes, if you lose conscious access to these primordial images, life becomes like a prison or a stable. That you could be regarded as living like an animal, I suppose. But it goes back into the unconscious and becomes charged, and then whatever, like he talks about reason becoming the arbiter of right and wrong and of good and evil by the human infatuation with reason when connection with deeper primordial archetypes is lost. Anyway, so moving on from there. I'm going to jump to one of the later essays in the book. This is from The Religious and Psychological Problems of Alchemy. Jung started exploring alchemy and Hermetic philosophy or Hermetic magic, Neoplatonic things, the occult, things like that. And he wrote a lot about his study of that. So this is one section from that, The Religious and Psychological Problems of Alchemy. He says, quote, "Every archetype is capable of infinite development and differentiation. It is therefore possible for it to be more developed or less. In an outward form of religion, where all the emphasis is on the outward figure, hence where we are dealing with a more or less complete projection, the archetype is identical with externalized ideas, but remains unconscious as a psychic factor. When an unconscious content is replaced by a projected image, to that extent, it is cut off from all participation in and influence on the conscious mind. Hence, it largely forfeits its own life, because prevented from exerting the formative influence on consciousness natural to it. What is more, it remains in its original form, unchanged, for nothing changes in the unconscious. At a certain point, it even develops a tendency to regress to lower and more archaic levels. It may easily happen, therefore, that a Christian who believes in all the sacred figures is still undeveloped and unchanged in his inmost soul, because he has all God outside and does not experience him in the soul. His deciding motives, his ruling interests and impulses, do not spring from the sphere of Christianity, but from the unconscious and undeveloped psyche, which is as pagan and archaic as ever. Not the individual alone, but the sum total of individual lives in a nation, proves the truth of this contention. The great events of our world, as planned and executed by man, do not breathe the spirit of Christianity, but rather of unadorned paganism. These things originate in a psychic condition that has remained archaic, and has not been even remotely touched by Christianity. The Church assumes, not altogether without reason, that the fact of having once believed leaves certain traces behind it, but of these traces nothing is to be seen in the march of events. Christian civilization has proved hollow to a terrifying degree. It is all veneer, but the inner man has remained untouched and therefore unchanged. The soul is out of key with the external beliefs. In his soul, the Christian has not kept pace with external developments. Yes, everything is to be found outside, in image and in word, in church and Bible, but never inside. Inside reign the archaic gods, supreme as of old. That is to say, the inner correspondence with the outer God image is undeveloped for lack of psychological culture, and has therefore got stuck in heathenism. Christian education has done all that is humanly possible, but it has not been enough. Too few people have experienced the divine image as the innermost possession of their own souls. Christ only meets them from without, never from within the soul. That is why dark paganism still reigns there, a paganism which now in a form so blatant that it can no longer be denied, and now in all too threadbare disguise is swamping the world of so-called Christian culture." End quote. So he's really drawing a connection between the archetypes, the undeveloped archetypes of the unconscious mind are unreached by Christianity and the Christian world when he's writing in the, I don't know, I'm not sure when he wrote that section, probably the 1940s. He's talking about how the march of civilization doesn't follow along Christian, but instead pagan forms, archetypal forms. I want to touch on a few other concepts of his. Namely, I want to mention the persona and the anima. We'll start with the persona in this section here. This is from back from the relations between the ego and the unconscious. This section, when he talks about the persona, he says, quote, "The persona is a complicated system of relations between individual consciousness and society. Fittingly enough, a kind of mask, designed on the one hand to make a definite impression upon others, and on the other to conceal the true nature of the individual. That the latter function is superfluous could be maintained only by one who is so identified with his persona that he no longer knows himself, and that the former is unnecessary could only occur to one who is quite unconscious of the true nature of his fellows. Society expects and indeed must expect, every individual to play the part assigned to him as perfectly as possible, so that a man who is a parson must not only carry out his official functions objectively, but must at all times and in all circumstances play the role of parson in a flawless manner. Society demands this as a kind of surety. Each must stand at his post, here a cobbler, there a poet. No man is expected to be both, nor is it advisable to be both, for that would be queer. Such a man would be different from other people, not quite reliable. In the academic world he would be a dilettante, in politics an unpredictable quantity, in religion a free thinker. In short, he would always be suspected of unreliability and incompetence, because society is persuaded that only the cobbler who is not a poet can supply workmanlike shoes. To present an unequivocal face to the world is a matter of practical importance. The average man, the only kind society knows anything about, must keep his nose to one thing in order to achieve anything worthwhile, while two would be too much. Our society is undoubtedly set on such an ideal. It is therefore not surprising that everyone who wants to get on must take these expectations into account. Obviously, no one could completely submerge his individuality in these expectations, hence the construction of an artificial personality becomes an unavoidable necessity. The demands of propriety and good manners are an added inducement to assume a becoming mask. What goes on behind the mask is then called private life. This painfully familiar division of consciousness into two figures, often preposterously different, is an incisive psychological operation that is bound to have repercussions on the unconscious. End quote. So basically he's saying that the persona is a sort of mask that we put on because society demands a certain form of behavior from its members. It demands that people carry out particular roles, the role of the poet, the parson, the cobbler, whatever it may be, the particular roles that people play in society. It demands that they play these roles in order for it to function as smoothly and orderly as possible. And so we build these personalities for ourselves, these masks, personas. Alright, so I'm going to wind this up now. There are a few other sections that I thought were pretty good that where he talks more about the anima and men and women and gender and things of that nature which are important in analytic psychology, the mother figure, things like that. But I'm not going to get into all that. This has gone on long enough. I'm going to wind it up here. So that I covered a whole bunch of sections of that book, the basic writings of Carl Jung, and what I thought were the most core elements. So I think what you got there is like the nitty-gritty writings that put into words most clearly the fundamentals of Carl Jung's approach to the archetypes and to some extent how that relates to religion and mythology. So that'll be all for now, and I'll catch you on the flip side. Bye.